Cavalier County, Dakota Territory, October 1883. While every homesteader on the northern plains was building fireplaces against their walls with chimneys rising straight up, Stanisław Kowalski was doing something that made his neighbors stop their wagons just to argue with him. The 34-year-old Polish immigrant was digging a pit 3 feet below his cabin floor, building his firebox at the bottom, and running stone channels beneath the entire structure before the chimney ever reached outside air. "He's built it upside down," one farmer told another. "The smoke will fill the house and kill them all." Nobody understood what Stanisław knew about heat that rises in floors that stay frozen. And if you want to find out what happened when January hit -42 degrees and his children played barefoot on warm stones while neighbors huddled over fires that heated nothing but the ceiling, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Stanisław Kowalski had arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1881, part of the great wave of Polish immigrants who fled the partitioned homeland seeking land and freedom in the American West. He'd left behind the Podlasie region in northeastern Poland, where winters stretched 6 months long and peasant families had refined survival techniques over generations of brutal cold under Russian imperial rule. In Poland, Stanisław had worked as a mason's apprentice in Białystok, learning to build the massive tile stoves that wealthy families used to heat their manor houses. But he'd also spent winters in village homes where poorer families couldn't afford such luxuries. Homes where clever builders had developed a different approach entirely. They built their fires below floor level, running smoke through stone channels beneath the living space before it ever reached the chimney. The floor became the heating surface, radiating warmth upward into the room where people actually lived. The physics were obvious to anyone who understood heat. Warm air rises. In a conventional fireplace, flames heated the air directly in front of the hearth, and that warm air immediately floated to the ceiling, the least useful place in any room. Families crouched near the flames while their heads baked and their feet froze. The ceiling collected heat that slowly leaked through the roof while the floor remained cold as the grave. The Polish village solution inverted everything. Put the fire below. Let the heat rise through the floor. Warm the surface where people actually stood, sat, slept, and lived. America promised land and opportunity. What it delivered in the northern reaches of Dakota Territory was winters that made Polish cold seem almost gentle, and an approach to heating that baffled Stanisław completely. His first January near the Canadian border nearly killed him. He'd been working as a farmhand on an established homestead, sleeping in a cabin with a conventional stone fireplace that roared all night and still couldn't keep the floor from frosting over. The American farmer burned wood constantly, feeding flames that sent their heat straight to the ceiling while everyone's feet went numb. They slept on raised platforms to escape the frozen floor, waking every few hours to feed the fire, cursing the cold that crept up from below. Stanisław watched this with quiet disbelief. The fireplace worked hard. The chimney drew well. The problem wasn't the fire. It was where the heat went afterward. Straight up to the ceiling, through the roof, into the Dakota sky. The floor, where the family spent their waking hours, received almost nothing. By 1883, Stanisław had saved enough from farm work and odd masonry jobs to claim 160 acres under the Homestead Act, 8 miles south of the Canadian border in Cavalier County. The land was flat, treeless, exposed to every wind that howled down from Manitoba. Other homesteaders had built conventional cabins with conventional fireplaces, fighting the same losing battle against cold that every Dakota settler fought. Stanisław would build something different. His nearest neighbor, a Norwegian farmer named Erik Lindgren, had watched Stanisław survey his new property with measuring ropes and stakes, marking not just the cabin footprint, but a complex pattern of trenches beneath it. "Planning a root cellar?" Lindgren asked, riding over to introduce himself. "A fireplace," Stanisław replied, his English still thick with Polish consonants. "Under the floor?" 3 feet down. The smoke travels beneath the cabin before it exits. The floor becomes warm. Lindgren stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. Not cruel, but genuinely confused. Friend, smoke rises. Fire goes in a fireplace against the wall, chimney goes up. That's how it works. In America, yes. In Poland, we learned to make heat go where we need it. The argument with his wife Zofhia began the moment Stanisław showed her where the fireplace would not be. He'd walked her through the cabin site, pointing at the network of trenches he planned to dig beneath the floor, the fire pit that would sit 3 feet below ground level, the stone channels that would snake across the entire foundation before finally releasing smoke through a chimney on the far wall. "The fire burns in a hole," Zofhia said flatly, staring at the marked ground. "Beneath our feet. In a stone chamber. Properly vented. The smoke never enters the room. It travels under the floor and exits outside. And if the stones crack, if smoke leaks through the floor, we will suffocate. The children will suffocate. The stones will not crack. I will build it properly, the way the old masons built in Podlasie. Thick channels, unsealed with clay, covered with stone slabs." Zofhia had followed her husband across an ocean, across half a continent, into a territory so remote that the nearest town was 3 hours by wagon. She'd endured the cramped ship, the crowded trains, the isolation of a land where almost no one spoke Polish. But building a fire pit beneath her children's feet felt like something else entirely. A risk too terrible to accept. "The Americans have fireplaces," she said quietly. "Stone fireplaces against the wall. They work. They work badly. They heat the ceiling while the floor freezes. I watched children sleep in their coats all winter because the floor was too cold. Our children will play barefoot on warm stones." Word of Stanisław's plan reached Eric Lindgren within the week. The Norwegian rode over on the pretense of discussing property boundaries and found Stanisław 3 feet deep in an excavation pit, laying out stones for the underground fire chamber. "Kowalski," Lindgren called down, "the men at the general store are talking about your fireplace." "Let them talk. They're saying you're building it backwards, underground, that you plan to run smoke beneath your floor." Lindgren shook his head slowly. "I've been farming this territory for 6 years. I've seen men try clever ideas, root cellars that flooded, sod roofs that collapsed. New approaches don't survive Dakota winters, friend. This approach survived centuries in Poland. Winters colder than this. Poland's got forests. Poland's got hills to block the wind. We've got grass and sky and cold that'll freeze your blood between the barn and the house." Lindgren crouched at the edge of the pit. "What happens when those smoke channels fill with soot? When the seals fail and carbon monoxide seeps through your floor while you sleep? I will clean the channels each autumn. The seals are clay over stone. They hold for decades. This is proven construction." The confrontation at the general store in Langdon came 2 weeks later. Stanisław had ridden in for supplies, lime, flat stones, fire clay, and found a group of homesteaders gathered near the counter discussing his project. "The Polak's building his fireplace in a hole," one said. 3 feet underground, smoke running beneath the floor. Man's either crazy or trying to kill his family. Heard he's got no proper chimney at all until the far wall. 40 feet of smoke channel under the cabin first, sis. That's not a fireplace. That's a way to die in your sleep." Stanisław collected his supplies without responding. He loaded the wagon, paid the storekeeper, and drove home through the autumn afternoon. The Americans could laugh. They could call him crazy. Come January, they'd be huddling around fireplaces that heated their ceilings while their children shivered on frozen floors. His children would play barefoot on warm stone while the prairie wind howled outside. What Stanisław Kowalski understood from generations of Polish village construction, modern heating engineers would later quantify with precision. But the principles he was applying had been refined over centuries by people who couldn't afford to waste a single BTU of heat and who understood exactly where warmth needed to go. The fundamental problem with conventional fireplaces was simple. Heat rises. When wood burns in a traditional hearth, the flames generate temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That superheated air immediately begins climbing, up through the firebox, up the chimney, up toward the ceiling of any room. A conventional fireplace might radiate 20% of its heat into the living space. The rest went straight up and out, warming the sky while families froze. But the problem went deeper than chimney loss, as even the heat that did enter the room behaved badly. Warm air rose to the ceiling, creating a temperature gradient that could span 30 degrees between floor and roof. Families experienced this as hotheads and frozen feet. The ceiling might reach 75 degrees while the floor hovered near freezing. The most useful heating zone, from floor to waist height, received almost nothing. Stanisław's system inverted this dysfunction entirely. By placing the firebox 3 feet below floor level and running the smoke through channels beneath the living space, he transformed the floor itself into a massive radiant heating surface. Heat no longer rose uselessly to the ceiling. It entered the room from below, warming the zone where people actually lived. The physics of radiant floor heating were remarkably efficient. The stone and masonry absorb heat slowly, but release it even more slowly, creating thermal mass that continued radiating warmth long after the fire died. A conventional fireplace demanded constant feeding. Let the flames die, and the room cooled within an hour. But Stanisław's stone floor, properly heated, would continue radiating warmth for 8 to 12 hours after the last log burned. The temperature distribution was equally superior. Radiant heat from below rose naturally through the living space, creating even warmth from floor to ceiling rather than the harsh gradient of conventional heating. More critically, the floor, the surface in constant contact with human feet, became the warmest part of the room rather than the coldest. Stanisław's channel design maximized heat extraction before the smoke ever exited. The fire pit sat at the lowest point, 3 feet below the cabin floor. From there, smoke entered a main channel that traveled to the center of the structure, then split into a serpentine pattern that snaked back and forth beneath the entire floor area before finally converging on the exit chimney at the far wall. The total path exceeded 40 feet, 40 feet of contact between hot smoke and stone floor slabs, 40 feet of heat transfer before a single BTU escaped to the outside air. The mathematics told the story. Hot smoke entering the channel system at 600 degrees would exit the chimney at perhaps 200 degrees. That 400-degree temperature drop represented captured heat. Energy that would have flown up a conventional chimney was instead stored in the stone floor, slowly radiating into the living space above. The key was thermal mass. The stone slabs covering the channels, each one 4 inches thick, absorbed heat during the burn period and released it gradually over many hours. Combined with the stone channel walls and the packed earth surrounding them, the system created a massive thermal battery beneath the cabin floor. His neighbors saw a fireplace as something you huddled in front of, feeding constantly, fighting to keep alive. Stanisław saw a fireplace as a heat source to be harvested efficiently, its energy captured in stone and slowly released through the coldest nights, not into the ceiling where it served no one, but into the floor where life actually happened. The excavation began in late May of 1883, as soon as the Dakota ground thawed enough to work. Stanisław had spent the winter preparing, collecting flat stones from a creek bed 10 miles distant, mixing fire clay with sand, planning every inch of the channel system that would snake beneath his cabin floor. The project would require more digging than any conventional homestead, but the materials cost almost nothing. The investment was of knowledge and labor. The fire pit came first. Stanisław dug a chamber 3 feet deep, 4 feet long, and 3 feet wide, lining it with the thickest stones he'd collected. The walls rose vertically, mortared with clay that would harden in the heat. A stone lintel across the top would support the access hatch. a removable slab that allowed him to feed the fire from inside the cabin without smoke entering the living space. The channel system required the most careful work. From the fire pit, Stanisław dug a trench 8 inches deep and 12 inches wide, running it in a serpentine pattern across the entire cabin footprint. The path traveled north from the fire pit, turned east, doubled back west, turned again, a continuous snake that covered 40 feet before finally reaching the chimney location on the far wall. He lined each section with flat stones laid on edge, creating smooth walls that wouldn't trap soot or obstruct airflow. The floor of each channel received the flattest stones, carefully fitted to prevent ash accumulation. Fire clay sealed every joint. Mixed thick and pressed into each gap, it would cure in the first firings and become nearly as hard as the stone itself. The channel covers came next. Large flat slabs, some weighing over 100 pounds, were laid across the trenches, creating the base layer of the cabin floor. Stanisław fitted them precisely, leaving no gaps where smoke could escape, yet ensuring they could be removed individually for cleaning. The seams received another layer of clay sealant, pressed into every crack. By July, the underground system was complete. 40 feet of stone channel snaking beneath a cabin footprint of 16 by 20 feet, connecting a sunken fire pit to a chimney that would rise from the far wall. Stanisław lit a small test fire and walked the floor above, pressing his palm against the stones at intervals. Within an hour, he could feel warmth radiating through the slabs, faint but unmistakable. The system drew properly. The heat transferred as planned. The cabin rose through August. Stanisław built the walls of hewn logs, chinked tight with clay and moss, but the floor received special attention. Above the stone channel covers, he laid a second layer of flat stones with sand between them, creating a smooth surface that would radiate heat evenly. The stones were fitted so tightly, a knife blade couldn't slip between them. The chimney rose from the far wall, a full 30 feet from the fire pit, marking the end of the smoke's underground journey. Stanisław built it of stone as well, rising 8 feet above the roofline to ensure proper draft. The draw would need to pull smoke through 40 feet of resistance before reaching open air. On September 15, 1883, Stanisław lit the first real fire in his completed system. He fed it steadily for 4 hours, letting the flames heat the stone chamber and send hot smoke coursing through the channels beneath his feet. By evening, the floor stones were warm to the touch, not hot, but pleasantly warm, radiating gentle heat upward into the cabin. Zofhia removed her shoes and stood on the warm stone floor, tears forming in her eyes. "It works," she whispered. "It has always worked," Stanisław replied. The Americans simply never learned. By late October, Stanisław Kowalski's cabin had become the most discussed structure in Cavalier County. Homesteaders made detours on their way to Langdon just to ride past and stare at the building with the chimney on the wrong wall. Cowboys gathered at the saloon to debate whether the Polish family would suffocate, freeze, or somehow burn down a cabin with no proper fireplace visible inside. The reactions had shifted from amusement to genuine alarm. "It's not natural," one homesteader declared at the general store, warming his hands near the pot-bellied stove. "A fireplace belongs against a wall where you can see it, where you can warm yourself by it. His family can't even sit by their fire. It's buried in the ground." "The smoke's got to be leaking somewhere," another agreed. "Run it under a floor for 40 feet and something will crack. They'll be dead by Christmas." Maybe that's the plan. Maybe he doesn't know any better. Someone ought to warn that wife of his. Eric Lindgren had inspected the completed cabin in early October, walking slowly through the single room while Stanisław explained the system. The Norwegian had pressed his palm against the floor stones, feeling the faint warmth still lingering from the morning fire, and shaken his head in disbelief. "It's warm," Lindgren admitted. "I'll grant you that. But it's barely cold yet. Wait until January. Wait until it's 40 below and you need real heat, not warm stones." The stones hold more heat than air ever could. When January comes, I burn longer fires. The floor stores the warmth and releases it all night. And when those channels fill with soot, when the clay seals crack from freezing and thawing, the channels are sized for cleaning. I built access points at each turn. The clay is mixed with sand for flexibility. This system has worked for centuries in Poland. This isn't Poland. Lindgren mounted his horse. I hope you're right, Kowalski. I genuinely do. But I've seen this territory humble men with better ideas than underground smoke. Zofhia faced her own pressures. The few women in the area had little contact with the Polish wife, but those who did expressed concern in careful terms. A farmer's wife named Ingrid Haugen stopped by in late October with a basket of preserved vegetables, a neighborly gesture that came with pointed questions. "Your cabin has no fireplace," Ingrid said, glancing around the interior. "No hearth. Where do you gather in the evening? How do you cook?" "We cook on a small iron stove for summer work. In winter, I cook over the fire pit. There is a grate above the flames." Zofhia gestured at the access hatch in the floor. "The fire is there, beneath us." Beneath? Ingrid touched the floor stones with her boot, feeling the slight warmth. "It's unusual. I've never felt anything like it. In Poland, the old homes all heated this way. The floor is warm. The children can play anywhere in the room, not just near the fire." The first hard frost came on November 6th. Stanisław lit a larger fire than usual in the underground pit, feeding it steadily for 6 hours before letting it die to coals. He and Zofhia retired for the night as temperatures dropped to 18 degrees outside. The floor radiated gentle, even warmth throughout the night. The thermometer by the door read 58 degrees at midnight, 52 degrees at dawn. No fire had burned for 8 hours. The thermal mass of the heated stones, sealed beneath the living space, had held its warmth while the Dakota wind howled outside. Zofhia woke to find her children sitting on the warm floor, playing with wooden toys in their night clothes. She had never seen them do that in winter. January 1884 arrived with a brutality that even the old-timers struggled to recall. An Arctic front descended from Manitoba on January 11th, driving temperatures from a mild 15 degrees to -22 by midnight. By dawn on January 12th, the mercury had plunged to -35, and on the morning of January 13th, the thermometer outside Eric Lindgren's farmhouse read -42 degrees, the coldest temperature recorded in Cavalier County since settlement began. The wind made it worse. Gusts of 30 miles per hour drove wind chills to numbers that defied survival. Exposed flesh froze in under a minute. Livestock that couldn't reach shelter died where they stood. The snow didn't fall so much as a tack, driving horizontally across the open prairie with nothing to stop its assault from the Canadian north. Across the county, the desperate battle for survival began. Eric Lindgren burned through his carefully stacked woodpile at an alarming rate. His stone fireplace roared day and night, flames leaping 3 feet high, yet frost formed on the cabin floor 10 feet from the hearth. His children slept in a pile of blankets on raised platforms, their breath visible in the cold air, their feet too frozen to touch the ground. He woke every 90 minutes to feed the flames, stumbling through darkness that seemed to press in from every direction. The Haugen family 3 miles west fared worse. Their chimney cracked on the second night, the temperature differential between the roaring fire inside and the killing cold outside splitting the mortar between the stones. They stuffed rags into the gap and burned twice the wood for half the heat, abandoning the main room entirely and huddling in a corner near the failing fireplace. A bachelor homesteader named William Garrett ran out of firewood on January 14th. He burned his furniture, then his floorboards, cutting away the very boards he stood on to feed the flames. When neighbors found him 2 days later, he was alive but delirious, crouching in a corner of a cabin with no floor, surrounded by frozen earth. At the Kowalski homestead, January 11th began like any other winter day. Stanisław woke before dawn, lifted the access hatch in the floor, and descended into the fire pit to light the morning blaze. He fed it steadily for 4 hours, dry oak and ash, burning hot and clean, while the smoke traveled its 40-foot journey beneath the cabin floor before exiting through the distant chimney. By the time temperatures plunged to -42, the stone floor had absorbed enough heat to radiate warmth for the next 12 hours. Stanisław and Zofhia spent the worst of the cold snap inside their cabin, venturing out only to tend the livestock and gather more fuel. The children, 5-year-old Marta and 3-year-old John, played on the floor in their stocking feet, the warm stones comfortable against their skin. They built towers with wooden blocks. They napped on blankets spread directly on the heated surface. They never once shivered. The thermometer by the door read 55 degrees on the coldest morning, when the air outside would freeze exposed flesh in seconds. The floor surface measured 72 degrees, warmer than the air above it, radiating gentle heat upward into the living space. On January 15th, Erik Lindgren sent a farmhand to check on the Polish family. The man rode through the brutal cold expecting to find frozen bodies or at least a family in desperate straits. Instead, he found Stanisław calmly splitting wood outside the cabin, his children visible through the frost-covered window playing barefoot on the floor. The farmhand returned with news that seemed impossible. The family with the backwards fireplace was warmer than anyone else in the territory. Erik Lindgren arrived at the Kowalski homestead on January 17th, 2 days after his farmhand had returned with the impossible report. The Norwegian had barely slept in a week. Constant fire feeding, frozen floors, children who woke crying from the cold. His face was raw and haggard, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He found Stanisław outside the cabin, stacking firewood at a leisurely pace. The Pole's woodpile, Lindgren noticed immediately, looked barely touched despite a week of the worst cold in memory. "Show me," Lindgren said without preamble. "Show me how you're still alive." Stanisław led him inside. The Norwegian stopped 3 steps through the door, his body registering what his mind couldn't accept. The air was warm, genuinely, comfortably warm, without a roaring fire visible anywhere. No flames leaping in a hearth. No red-hot stove glowing in the corner. Just 4 log walls and a stone floor that seemed to radiate heat like a living thing. "Touch the floor," Stanisław said. Lindgren crouched and pressed his palm against the smooth stones. Warmth met his frozen skin, not hot, but distinctly, pleasantly warm. He moved his hand across the surface, feeling the temperature consistent everywhere, no cold spots, no frozen patches near the walls. "It's warm," Lindgren breathed. "The whole floor is warm." 72 degrees at the surface. The air is 55. The heat rises from below, warming everything it meets. The Kowalski children sat in the corner playing with wooden toys, barefoot on the heated stones. Lindgren stared at them like they were apparitions. "My children sleep in 3 layers of wool," he said quietly. They haven't taken their boots off in a week." Stanisław retrieved his notebook from a small shelf and opened it to the pages covering the cold snap. He'd been recording temperatures obsessively. Exterior readings, floor surface temperatures, air temperatures at floor level and ceiling level, fire pit burn times. January 13th, Stanisław read. Outside temperature at dawn, -42. Floor surface temperature, 71 degrees. Air temperature at floor level, 54 degrees. Air temperature at ceiling, 51 degrees. Fire pit burn time, 4 hours morning, 3 hours evening. Total wood consumed, 60 pounds. Lindgren took the notebook, flipping through pages of careful recordings. The numbers inverted everything he thought he knew about heating. Floor temperatures warmer than air temperatures, ceilings cooler than floors. Consistent warmth throughout the room rather than scorching heat near the fire and freezing cold everywhere else. 60 pounds, Lindgren repeated. We burned 400 per day, almost 7 times as much. Your fire heats the air. The air rises to the ceiling, leaks through the roof, disappears forever. You must keep burning to replace what is lost. Stanisław gestured at the floor beneath their feet. My fire heats the stones. The stones hold the heat. The heat rises slowly, warming the room from below. I burn once in the morning, once in the evening. The floor stays warm all night. Lindgren walked the cabin slowly, pressing his hand against the floor at intervals. The warmth was remarkably consistent, the same gentle heat whether he stood near the fire pit hatch or in the far corner by the chimney. The channels, he said. How do you know they won't fill with soot and block? I built cleaning hatches at each turn. Every autumn I clear the passages with brushes and rods. The system is designed for maintenance. Lindgren closed the notebook and handed it back. He looked around the cabin again, the children playing barefoot, the mother working at the table in comfortable clothing, the gentle warmth rising from below. I called you crazy, he said finally. Told everyone you were building a death trap. You didn't understand. How could you? You had never felt heat from below. The first visitor after Eric Lindgren was the farmer whose children hadn't removed their boots in a week, a man named Olaf Bergstrom, who arrived on January 19th with desperation in his eyes and frostbite blackening 2 of his fingers. Lindgren told me about your floor, Bergstrom said, standing in the Kowalski doorway with his hat in his hands. Said your children play barefoot while mine sleep in wool coats. I need to see it. I need to understand. Stanisław welcomed him without hesitation. Bergstrom spent an hour in the warm cabin, crouching to touch the heated stones, watching the Kowalski children play in their stocking feet, pressing his damaged hands against the warm floor surface as if it could heal what the cold had taken. It's like summer in here, Bergstrom whispered. The heat comes from everywhere. The heat comes from below. It rises into everything. The furniture, the walls, the people. No cold spots. No frozen floors. By the end of January, Stanisław had hosted 14 families in his cabin, some seeking refuge from failing fireplaces, others simply needing to experience the impossible for themselves. Homesteaders who'd laughed at the backwards fireplace now sat on his warm floor with their boots removed for the first time in weeks, asking questions about stone channels and fire pit depths and clay sealant mixtures. Eric Lindgren was first to commit to building his own system. He arrived in early February with his 2 eldest sons, notebooks ready, prepared to learn everything Stanisław could teach. The excavation comes first, Stanisław explained, or walking them through the construction sequence on paper. 3 feet deep for the fire pit, 8 inches deep for the channels. The pattern must cover the entire floor. No shortcuts, no dead spots. He spent 4 days teaching stone selection, channel construction, proper clay mixing ratios. He showed them how to lay flat stones for smooth smoke flow, how to seal joints without blocking the passage, how to build access hatches for annual cleaning. You're giving away everything, Zofhia observed one evening after yet another group had departed with pages of diagrams and instructions. Knowledge hoarded is knowledge lost, Stanisław replied. In Poland, every village knew how to build heated floors. Here, I am the only one. If I keep the secret dies with me. If I share it, it lives forever. The first new construction began at the Lindgren farm in April. Stanisław supervised personally, checking every channel depth, testing every stone placement, ensuring the system would draw properly when completed. The Norwegian and his sons did the labor while the Polish immigrant guided every decision. By June, 3 more systems were under construction across the county. A German immigrant named Friedrich Weber adapted the design for a larger cabin, running 60 feet of channels beneath a 20 by 24 floor. A widow named Margaret Olsen hired hands to retrofit her existing cabin, lifting the floorboards and excavating channels beneath a home that had nearly killed her family the previous winter. The Langdon newspaper ran a story in August about the Polish method of radiant floor heating. Letters arrived from across Dakota Territory, from Minnesota and Montana, from settlers desperate for any alternative to fireplaces that heated ceilings while floors froze. Stanislaw answered every letter. He drew diagrams, explained principles, described the construction sequence in careful detail. He charged nothing, refused payment even when it was pressed upon him. In Poland, this knowledge belonged to everyone who needed it, he told Lindgren. It should belong to everyone here as well. Cold does not choose its victims by nationality. Neither should warmth. The man who built his fireplace backwards had become the most important teacher in Cavalier County. Stanislaw Kowalski lived another 41 years on that Dakota homestead. He died in 1924, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd grown up playing barefoot on warm stone floors while blizzards raged outside. The original cabin stood until 1952, when his grandson finally dismantled it to build a modern house with a basement furnace. The underground channels were still intact after nearly 70 years. No cracks, no collapses. The same system that had kept the family warm through the brutal winter of 1884 still functioning perfectly. The winter of 1884 remained the benchmark against which all subsequent Dakota winters were measured. Old-timers would ask each other, "Is it as bad as '84?" And the answer was almost never yes. But lesser winters still killed livestock and exhausted families who fought the cold with conventional fireplaces that heated ceilings while floors froze. Every frozen morning reminded them of what Stanislaw had proven possible. By 1895, radiant floor heating systems had spread beyond Cavalier County into neighboring Pembina, Walsh, and Towner counties. Agricultural journals published articles about the Polish method of underfloor heating. The North Dakota Agricultural Extension invited Stanislaw to speak at their annual meeting in 1901. The immigrant once mocked for building his fireplace backwards, now addressing an audience of 300 farmers hungry for knowledge that could transform their winters. "Heat rises," Stanislaw told them through his still thick Polish accent. "This is physics no man can change. The question is where you let it rise from. A fireplace against the wall, the heat rises to the ceiling, useless. A fire beneath the floor, the heat rises through the room, warming everything it meets. Same fire, same fuel, different results." Eric Lindgren never went back to conventional heating. His farm became a showcase for the radiant system, with every building eventually converted to underfloor channels. His sons built their own homesteads with the Polish method as the foundation, literally, and the Lindgren family would remain in Cavalier County for 4 generations, each one walking on warm floors, while their neighbors huddled around fireplaces. The principle Stanislaw understood, using radiant heat from below rather than convective heat from beside, appears today in modern radiant floor heating worldwide. Hydronic systems pump heated water through tubes beneath floors. Electric systems warm cables embedded in concrete. The mathematics have been refined, the materials modernized with plastic tubing and digital thermostats, but the core insight remains unchanged. Heat the floor and the room takes care of itself. What Stanislaw knew, what generations of Polish village builders knew, was that fighting physics wastes energy, while cooperating with physics multiplies it. His neighbors let heat rise to their ceilings, then burned more wood trying to replace what was lost. Stanislaw captured heat in thermal mass beneath his feet, releasing it slowly upward into the space where his family actually lived. The lesson extends beyond heating systems. Every problem has brute force solutions that exhaust those who attempt them, and elegant solutions that work with natural forces rather than against them. Stanislaw's neighbors saw heat rising as an obstacle. Stanislaw saw it as a delivery mechanism, carrying warmth from the floor into every corner of the room. Zofhia outlived Stanislaw by 6 years. She spent her final winters walking on the warm stone floors they'd built together. the same floors where her children had played barefoot and her grandchildren had learned to crawl. After she passed, her daughter found a note tucked into the family Bible, written in Zofhia's careful Polish script. He said the fire belonged beneath our feet. I said he was building a tomb. He built us the warmest home in Dakota Territory, and our children never knew what it meant to have frozen floors. He understood something the Americans never learned. Heat wants to rise. Let it rise through you.